Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be exploring how to code a grid in Pts.js, in this case, a grid of squares. So why are we doing this? Well, I recently released TimeTick, which is a visualization of time, and one of its pages, time, tries to visualize elapsed time versus time remaining in a form of a dynamic grid. So let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so here we are at timetick.xyz/time, and we can kind of see that you give a birth year, a birth month, and expected years, and it tries to show you, in the black squares all the time that's been spent, and then the white squares all the time that is theoretically left. And so I'm using a grid to kind of show this. Each line is one year, so each dot is like a month. But I wanted it to be configurable. So if I put in 1990 here, I need the grids to actually update and change. And if the birth month is now, like, let's say you were born in October, I wanted the squares to change as well. And so to do this with different configurations and stuff, I needed a good way to basically build a grid dynamically. And for the past few weeks, I've been exploring visualizations using Pts.js because it's a declarative visualization library, and I think declarative provides a lot of interesting features. And so I wanted to use this to build that dynamic grid, and so that's where I kind of ran into this problem of how to actually build it. And so that's what we're going to be answering in this video, specifically how can I build a dynamic grid with Pts.js. We're going to be covering it in such a way that hopefully you can reuse this for different kinds of shapes, so like circles or, I don't know, smiley faces, whatever you want, and put those in a grid, and then also different sizes of grids. So, I don't want you to just limit you to things of like width 12, but you should be able to input kind of whatever you get and get all your shapes out in that grid in a nice manner. So as always, I'm going to kind of show you what we're going to end up with at the end of this video. Basically, I'm going to be using the Pts.js playground to kind of demo this to you, and then I'm going to be using just the demo code that's available in my blog post here, so you can copy and paste it into the playground, and you should be able to get the same result. So here we are in the editor. Right now, this is a 4x6 grid, and if I change this to like 4x10, we should see that, our grid is dynamic. So here it is 4x10, we can change it to 2x10. And so now you can kind of see that, we have a reusable generic way that we can pass in different parameters to create a grid out in whatever form we want. And so that demo is what we're going to be building up towards. In the rest of this video, we're going to dive into specific parts of this to make it as easy to understand as possible. First, I'm just going to give an overview of what that solution did. Then we're going to go into the specific grid code that we're using to actually lay out all of these shapes in an easily parameterizable and dynamic way. And then finally, we're going to dive into the solution code that I had just showed you that actually powers that demo, so you can kind of put all these concepts together. All right, so first, high-level solution overview. I like to always start with pseudocode because if you don't know what you're trying to build, then it's like basically impossible to code it well. What we're trying to do is do a grid of squares, so no matter what library or language we use, we basically got to do these things. We got to create some squares, we got to move those squares into a grid, including calculating like how does that actually look, where should they go, and then we got to draw all those squares to the canvas so it actually appears on whatever thing we're visualizing this into. Now, obviously, the key component of this is how we're actually calculating the grid layouts and stuff like that. So we're going to dive into that here. Now, this PowerPoint thing is not great for vertical kinds of like layouts like code. So I'm going to dive over into my blog post here, which has that code that you can copy and paste, and we will go through it there. Okay, so here we are in my blog post. Hopefully you can read this. It's maybe a little small, so let me increase it even more. Oh no, the ad's in the way. So here we are at 200%. Hopefully you can read this. If not, go to my website and look at the code yourself. So here we're just defining basically a build center grid of rectangles. If you wanted, you could obviously parameterize the shape that you're building here. We're going to pass in a canvas space here, which is basically points version of where we're drawing to. We're basically just using this to get the center. We need a way to get the center. And so you could do this in a lot of ways, but I just wanted to pass the space for now. We're going to get the rectangle count per row. So basically the width, the row count, which is basically the height. And then we also need the rectangle size. So how big are each of these squares going to be, which will help us understand how to draw this and how to provide spacing and stuff like that. So the first thing I'm doing here is I am building an array of all the rectangles that we're going to have in our grid. And I'm doing this by creating an array of width times height. I'm filling it with dummy data just so that it actually materializes. And then I'm mapping over each of these dummy values to just create a new rectangle. We're creating it just in the center and a rectangle size. So if you were to draw all the rectangles now, it would just look like one square because they're all kind of overlapping each other. Next, I'm looping over every single rectangle that we have and trying to draw it in the correct space. And so basically you can imagine that as we go over the array, we're trying to draw each row line by line. Now this gets a little complicated because we're trying to center things. So I'm going to try to explain this as we go, but just centering things is hard. So it's okay if you kind of don't really understand this section and just copy and paste it. It should be fine. So basically for the x value, we're starting at space center of 0. This is the x value. They just use basic arrays and points. So just trust me, this is x and this is y. And the first thing we're going to do here in this first parenthesis is try to understand what index of x is it. And so as we're going over each one, we're increasing I. And so basically we can see like, hey, the x index that you are is going to be whatever your current count is, modulus how many we have per row, because whatever that remainder is, that must be your index for the new row that you're on. And so hopefully this one is pretty easy to understand. But the next thing we got to do is actually subtract the index such that we're taking away half the row. And the reason that we have to do this is because we're trying to center something. And so if we didn't do this, you could imagine that, you know, we would get our indices correct, but it all would always be to like the right of center because we're only doing addition. So in this way, we're basically taking away half so that the first half of the row will provide a negative index, and then the second half will provide a positive index, and thus we can just multiply it by the magnitude, and that's how we get a centered row, if you will. And so this is the index, and then we just multiply by the magnitude, which is going to be our rectangle size, and then you might imagine that you'd say rectangle size plus spacing. I just decided spacing would be rectangle size as well, so I just do times 2. So that's for the x value. Hopefully that makes sense. For the y value, we got to do something similar. So we're starting at space.center of y, and then we got to figure out the index. Now we're basically doing the same thing, but a little bit different, where first we're going to floor I divided by rectangle count per row. And so instead of trying to get the remainder, we actually need to know how many rows have we completed. We can do that by just dividing the current rectangle number that we're at by the number per row, and then flooring that value so that we get the same one for every item in the row. And so that's how, if we know that we're on like say the 5th row, everything needs to start at this y value. The next part again is just trying to figure out how do we center this thing. And so we just subtract the row count over 2, and that again allows the first half of our y value rows to be negatives so that it's above center, and then the second half to be positive so that it's below center. And then finally we gotta multiply it by our magnitude, which again is just rectangle size for the square, and then I'm just making the spacing rectangle size as well, so we just multiply that by 2. Now that we've calculated our x, y values, we basically just take that rect and we move it to this x, y value. Now one thing to call out is these rectangles are actually groups of points, because that's how points deals with shapes internally. And so this is actually a helper function that's on a group points, and so this is doing a little bit of math internally to try and make sure that it places those in the same space and it's moving them together. Finally, we should have all these rectangles, or this list of all rectangles, moved to the position they should be in our grid, so we can just return that, and then whoever calls this can do something with those rectangles. All right, so that is basically how we draw a grid. How do we actually use this thing? And so we're going to go back to this demo that I showed you earlier at the beginning of the video, and we'll walk through the code that we have there. Hopefully it'll make a lot more sense now. So here we are back at the demo. We still have our 2x10 or whatever, and I'll just move it back to like 4x5. Let's run it. Okay, so here I got a little 4x5 grid, and we'll just walk over this. So we're in the playground, which means that Points.js is already imported for us because it's just part of the playground. And so we just have this function that just kind of runs as soon as this loads. We're doing the quick start here, which basically just finds a DOM node, attaches the points sketch to it, and then we're setting the background to a color, here just white. And here we're just copy and pasted the code that you saw earlier. It looks a little weird because I had to take away some of the types, because this isn't TypeScript, this is just JavaScript. But this code is exactly the same of what we just went through. And so now we're coming down to the run function, which is like loop or update or animate loop in like Three.js or P5.js or any of these more or other kind of engines. And this is where we're actually drawing the rectangles. So the first thing we're doing is we are calling our grid helper here. We're giving it the space that was created as part of our points quick start, giving it the width, giving it the height, and then we're giving it the size of the squares that we want to have here. And I can show you that, you know, if we bump this to 30, our squares should get bigger, and there they are. And so now this gives us our grid of squares, and everything is like moved to the position that it should be, but it's not actually going to draw anything to the canvas yet. And in order to do that, we actually have to iterate over all the rectangles we have and tell the sketch that we want to draw. And so what we're going to do is iterate over each rectangle. We're going to use the form that was provided in Points Quick Start, give it a fill, give it a stroke, and then tell it what it needs to draw. And we're using the .polygon rectangle.corners here to make sure that it knows that this is a rectangle. This is what the group represents, and that's how it should draw it. So hopefully that makes sense how this all works. I would highly recommend going and getting the code for yourself, plugging it into the playground and playing around with it to see kind of how different configurations end up working. Now, I kind of glanced over a lot of little Points.js peculiarities if you're coming from like P5.js or any kind of other graphic library that's a little bit more imperative. And so if you want to go into some more fundamentals like space, form, time, stuff like that, that's interesting in Points, you can check out this intro to Points that I just put out, which goes over some of that stuff. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.